and my teaching voice today. And the reason Mary asked those questions is because my scholarship, I'm a specialist in American material culture from the 19th and 20th centuries, and have worked on the history of domestic life and published on that. But my most recent book and the scholarship that I am really going to be involved with, I think, the rest of my career is I study the history of animal-human interaction. And I published a book in 2006 on the history of pet keeping called Pets in America. I'm not going to be talking about that today, but of course I'm always happy to talk about this, if anybody wants to talk about it. We also did when I published that, I had just left South Carolina. I've been teaching in South Carolina and involved with the University of South Carolina Museum, University Museum in McKissick. And we produced a traveling exhibition that went on the road for about 3 years on the history of pet keeping. And actually we're sort of talking about reviving that and putting that back out as a smaller, low security show that would only be about 1,000 to 1,200 square feet. So if you have an organization that might be interested in this, let me know. So at any rate, so I work on the history of animal-human interaction, but also what I'm going to share with you today is, boy, I'll tell you, these are some rough thoughts, and not everything I talk about today is going to apply to everybody. But let me just start by asking, so bear with me, some things will be relevant to what you're doing, some things will be less relevant, but hopefully of interest to you. Let me ask how many of you are in organizations that are have an active collecting program, or actively collecting? Okay, all right, very good, thank you. And what we're going to do today, and how many of you are have rooms full of objects that have never been inventoried and you're not sure what they are? Yeah, you are owning up, and that's okay. That's totally okay. And I'll tell you why that's okay. Let me just say that as a historian of American material culture and a museum lover, I've been concerned for a long time that public collections are in trouble, even as the private world of collections and collectors is thriving. And as a Monday night hour with Antiques Roadshow will suggest to you, that collecting is going more time spent on eBay or any of these other, even Pawn Stars and hours spent watching Pawn Stars will suggest to you that collecting is thriving. For small organizations, some of the troubles are very basic. And several years ago, I have the benefit of being in a very small state. We only have 3 counties, which makes using ourselves as a lab really easy and good. It lets us sort of experiment with delivering content in different kinds of ways. And several years ago, the Delaware State Library received a Connecting to Collections planning grant. We've just finished just finishing our implementation grant. Which was intended to assess conservation issues associated with archival and artifact collections throughout the state. However, the surveyors quickly discovered a much more fundamental problem. They estimated that 80% of the collections, both archives and artifacts in the state, were not inventoried. So that, ergo, they were essentially inaccessible, and it wasn't even possible to do a full assessment, a conservation assessment, or even other kinds of collections care issues. Because of the situation, just as a sidebar, I was, I must say, appalled but not surprised. And I came up with the idea of what we call the collection SWAT team. And every January, I take a group of students to a small organization for 2 weeks, and we inventory the collection. I can talk to some of you about that at break time. It's actually a model that we're starting. We've done 3 so far, but now we're developing the SWAT team model as something that we're hoping to be able to import to other organizations. As once we come up with sort of a simple manual on how to do one of these SWAT teams. We used university grad students this past year. Actually, I had a few undergrads. I had 12 students inventorying their collection. We inventoried the entire collection of the Auburn Heights Preserve Historic Site, so in 8 days. As we work on developing this model, this is something we're using graduates for, but there's no reason you can't use undergraduates for this. or even we see it as a potential really good micro-volunteering opportunity, right, where you bring in a group of people who are interested in your organization but don't have the ability to be sort of weekly volunteers or whatever, where they come in and can really do something for you in a more constrained sort of time window. So let me just say that, so I acknowledge that, a lot of you guys have major management issues, and there's something that you have to deal with, but one of the things that happens is the management issues start to look so large that the collections, you wind up not taking advantage of your own collections. They sit there in their storerooms, in their boxes, in your attic, even in your basement, and maybe because you're embarrassed about their condition, or you're worried you're not even sure what's there, consequently they're essentially dead collections. Management issues like this one, which is from the Laurel Historical Society for a project we did in the Laurel Historical Society in Laurel, Delaware, means that stories, collections are not accessible, and that the stories attached to them often get lost. In this case, we discovered a clothing collection. Thank you. We discovered a clothing collection that had been stored in black plastic bags for 20 years and not open. This is not uncommon, and I'm not saying this to any of you guys. I don't want you to go, I don't want to listen to one more second of this because it makes me feel too guilty. Don't feel like that. That's just sort of the way it is out there. And one of the problems that comes out of this, though, is that you're afraid to look in there, you're afraid to see what's going on, you're afraid to sort of bring things out for people to see them because you're worried about condition, and consequently, it's, as I say, it's a dead collection. And the stories that did come in with it die off and disappear, right? Which is really a shame. So oftentimes. Let's see, I've lost my own place. I always do this. I've lost my place already. Okay. The collections that for community-based or regional historical organizations, which are the ones that I'm particularly interested in these days, are often marked by other problems. Oftentimes, collecting activities were based on a specific need. People organize a historic house. They save a historic house, and they decide they need to furnish it. So a lot of stuff comes in the door, and then, without a furnishing plan, but out of a community desire to sort of open a place, represent the community, and so on. What happens then is that you've got a collection that, appropriateness issues aside, because things have come in so quickly and have never received any kind of full kind of documentation, that again, family provenance, other kinds of stories associated with them disappear over time. Collecting activities in smaller organizations often proceed in fits and starts, and that reflects the presence often of a particular individual with an interest in old things. I mean, some of you may belong to organizations where there was a person some number of years ago who brought in a lot of stuff, perhaps associated with a specific historic structure or personal interest of one kind. What happens, though, is that these collections they no longer reflect the evolving communities that the museums are in, eventually. Perhaps they never reflected their communities. The founders of historical organizations often had an understanding of historical significance that was skewed or that reflected a particular agenda associated with the preservation of community elites, really what I would call a material culture politics. Where I saw this quite a bit when I was in South Carolina, where in the early 60s, a lot of historic sites were founded in communities. A tremendous amount of activity, and it was all elite white women doing this. And in fact, what became evident the more I studied these organizations was that they were an elite cultural response to pressures from the civil rights movement. They wanted to make sure that the story that they thought was really important got preserved. Well, it got preserved, but what happened was other stories in the community were neglected, and people wound up with an infrastructure and a collection that really did not represent the sort of evolving characters of their own communities, but represented a sort of vision of the past, right, that they had a personal commitment to. The true rich local historical organizations have also often had a significant bias towards collecting domestic life at the expense of other kinds of community life. That's what house museums are about, right? And what happens is that the true richness of community, of life in your community, of work, with the possible exception of pre-industrial craft, which always has a constituency, of work, of associational life, of community politics, of local business. Boy, that's an area that nobody collects, and that is a crime, especially when these small communities are under increasing pressure from, as I drove through Middletown, Delaware today, and there was Walmart and Lowe's and all this stuff, and you know that the community hardware stores, the community pet store, the community based clothing stores, all those things are under pressure, and they're in danger of going if they have not gone already. And we are not collecting that. We're not collecting those businesses. So I would venture to say that for most historical societies that you're probably not out gathering important local election signs, yard signs, which you should be, right? And not every sign of everybody, but especially when you have some kind of really important community issue or community race, not collecting that kinds of political material is a real issue. When the volunteer fire department decides to buy new safety gear, chances are you were not out collecting examples of the old gear or the stories of the particular fires or firefighters to go with it. Okay. That's a big piece. Volunteer fire departments are a big part of small communities, and again, underrepresented either in archives or in artifact collections. Leaving the issue of collecting bias aside, the majority of collections are also invisible to the public, and I view this as a particular problem. Beginning in the 1980s, there we go. The other thing is, I've sort of gone past this, but we'll come back to it. One of the things that often happens is because your collection isn't fully inventoried and you're not quite sure what's in there and you're a little reluctant to root around and see what's going on, is you produce exhibits that don't have any artifacts in them. I mean, you feel like you have to commemorate the Civil War, as in this case, and what we have is a bunch of reproduction photographs and a flag and 2 modern hats. Okay. Well, I mean, I'm glad that, I think it's important to commemorate the Civil War, but why would I want to come, or anybody in your own community want to come in and see this, right? It's a book, right? It should have been a booklet. It shouldn't have been an exhibit. So oftentimes you've got stuff, but for some reason or another you're a little concerned about bringing it out. Maybe you don't feel like you've got good intellectual control of it. So you do exhibits like this, which not very interesting exhibit. Okay. So let me talk a little bit about old techniques, and I talk a little bit about visible storage, because that's one of the things that came out of the 80s that actually small organizations pioneered visible storage. This is an example of it. I call this collections rule. This is one of the relic halls of the Daughters of Utah Pioneers Museum in Salt Lake City, and when I taught at the University of Utah, I loved this place. Now they had created a fairly modern building for themselves, but then they had gone out and they'd gotten cases from the Zion Commercial Mercantile Company department store when it updated its cases. So, it's the usual thing about you've got old store cases and things like that. But what they had done is they wanted to, to some extent, because they view their collections as relics, they were very careful to collect the stories that went with them, because they wanted to attach them to specific families. Okay. And then they wanted to make sure things were out because people were coming to see what was associated with their families. So you wind up with an environment like this, which violates all kinds of modern practice, including stuff that I taught myself and regret profoundly. And in fact, lots of people came in here, lots of people were really interested, lots of people found this relevant to them because it was related to their family. And this very old-fashioned installation was really, I think, a form of visible storage, which is a concept that became really popular in the 1980s. Here's an example of visible storage. Very, very sexy visible storage. This is a fantastic Native American pottery center at the Arizona State Museum in Tucson. It's just kind of, this is actually called the Wall of Pots, which is really fantastic, really quite fantastic. And needless to say, most people don't have the budget, most organizations don't have the budget to do anything like that. But to tell you the truth, in some respects, this and this are direct, this is the ancestor of this. Okay. They also even have, one of the things they did here that I like, and that is something I'm gonna return to a little bit, is they want you to see behind the scenes. So this is a vault. They actually have their storage vault is visible through doors. Here's their humidity monitoring and their climate control information, and they sort of explain what they're doing in there. So they're giving people a look behind the scenes, and I'm going to talk about that some more because I think the key to small museums is that there can be no more behind the scenes. It all has to be out front. Okay, that the day of behind the scenes is over for small organizations. One of the things I see in some small organizations is what I'm calling the online relic hall, which is blogging about collections. This is an opportunity, and we'll be talking a little bit more about, I'll be talking a little more about digital access. This is a chance for you to bring out buried treasures. But the big problem with collections blogs at this point is that most organizations that have them, this is actually Montgomery County, Maryland. Montgomery County Historical Society is a very good collections blog. Very good collections blog. But if you look at most of the entries, there's no comments on them. I'm not sure they're getting any traffic, right? This is a worthwhile approach for getting collections out there, but the problem is that people don't find it, don't pick up on it, it's not marketed. And I think one of the reasons for this is because all the content is coming from the curator, right? No one else is getting to write. No one else is getting to play. So they don't have any reason to get on there and look. They can't see their friends. I got to do a blog post so that people will look and see what they did, okay? But this is actually this is actually quite a good blog. Blogs are easier to do than you think. And actually you can even do a sort of a super simple version on Facebook, although you're not supposed to, but you can use the photo albums and their notes sections to actually put material about your collections. It's a really easy way to do it. And we can talk a little bit more about that. Okay. As I said, study storage is expensive, and some artifacts indeed are too fragile to be on display all the time. But if you're a small organization, you may want to consider getting more stuff out in other ways. For example, the use of discovery cases that rotate out some of your buried treasures in some kind of temporary open storage. And what I would say to you is to not be too concerned about condition with this, that I'm actually a great believer. One of the things that I'm afraid conservators have done to us is they've made us think that stuff on display has to have been, has to have been spiffed up, has to have been cleaned and sorted out and, sort of made look as good as new in some respects. And I actually think that that's a mistake, because one of the things that old beat up stuff has is it has patina. It's real. People know that it's old, they know that it's real, they know that it's had a life, right? It's had a life of use. So I don't think you should ever feel self-conscious about putting stuff out that is a little broken around the edges or maybe a little dirty, right? Because it actually tells you that objects have biography. I think it's more important to get things out than it is to worry about some of these niceties about display. So what I'm going to do is talk a little bit more about you can see I'm sort of skipping around a little bit. This is sort of an essay in progress, so you're going to see my mind as it sort of works through some of this stuff. One of the things that is starting to happen is an interest in getting more voices talking about objects besides your own voices. This is a real challenge for museum people. We want to maintain control over content. And if there's one thing that the web has taught us, is that you can't do it, right? They're snapping pictures of your stuff and posting them on Facebook. They're commenting on things. People are commenting on things. And so what has happened is that you know, we have to start thinking about what the web, people who work on the web call community curated content. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. That requires that you cede a little bit of authority, okay? That you give people a chance to play, even if you don't always 100% agree with what they said. Okay? It may be, now if someone posts outright mistakes, you can always comment on them and correct them. That's the other thing that happens is if you allow people to post information that is not 100% correct, then if a student, for example, posts content, then you actually have the ability to talk to them and say, well, maybe you didn't get that quite right. Let's talk about how you might find the new, better information, or new information, or what might be good information, or maybe I can share something I know. Okay. So one of the kinds of places that have been actually experimenting with this, with ceding a little bit of control in interesting ways, is very unusual, is actually art museums, which are, you want to talk about control freaks, right? I mean, art curators are control freaks of the first order. You know, they put labels up, they're authoritative labels, and that's all she wrote. But what's starting to happen is I think that education departments are starting to sort of chip away at this a little bit and sort of making spaces for other activities. So what we're going to do is talk a little bit about getting other points of view in the curation process by bringing the arts into the practice of history. So let me show you one of the things. And this is one of the ones that was, how many of you guys ever saw Mining the Museum in the early 90s? A few of you saw that. In the early 90s, the Maryland Historical Society brought in an artist named Fred Wilson, an African-American artist, and asked him to consider doing a reinstallation of collections objects to sort of comment on the narratives that the Maryland Historical Society had been putting out in the way that it displayed its collections. But what he did is he got around and dug around in the collections, and he was particularly interested in race relations, racism, and the history of race in Maryland. So one of the things that he did was, this was actually an art installation. And probably the single most controversial thing he did on the left is somebody in Maryland had, thank goodness, but had collected a whipping post. And that's a whipping post on the left. And then what he did is he gathered chairs, sort of fancy chairs around it on the right, and the idea had to do with sort of looking at and acknowledging, right, sort of practices in the past and racial practices in the past that were problematic. He also did some things that were a little less overtly kind of provocative. On the right we have, this is a photograph of African-American family in Maryland, and then he juxtaposed them to these sort of mammy figures in popular culture, and he sort of set them side by side and was trying to get people to contrast the real people with these sort of cartoony archetypes. Well, this certainly got people's attention, okay, and he actually has gone on to make a career out of doing what he calls these interventions in museum collections. I'm not suggesting this is a route that you go, okay, but what I do want to say is that he did open up the idea that it was possible for other people to come in and say something meaningful about museum stuff, okay, that it wasn't just the staff that got to sort of tell all the stories. And what he did was suggest that there was an invisible story actually embedded in the collections, and that he could bring out that story and get people to think about it by getting stuff out, by juxtaposing things in interesting ways, and then sort of sitting back and seeing what happened. Now, this one I want to show you because this one is actually something that is reproducible on the small scale. This is The Museum of the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, MUSA, has a fantastic collections blog, a really thoughtful collections blog that I've actually, one of the few that I actually follow. And they have lots of interesting collections that have to do with the history of the university and the community. And they decided that they would like to try to get some different voices involved in talking about their collections. So St. Andrews sponsored a poetry festival called the Stanza Festival, and the museum invited poets to write poems about objects in the collection, and then posted the poems in the cases with the, next to the objects and next to the label. Okay. This object up here. This is from the blog, so it seems a little. Those are what are called cage balls or catch balls, which were a form of handball that people played in the 18th century, and apparently it was illegal at the university, but students did it anyways. And so when they did a renovation of a church, they discovered a stash of cage balls wrapped in a piece of cloth tucked into a wall. Right? There were people, kids and students that had them, and they had hidden them. So, so they brought them out, and they're on display. And then this poet, Chris Lawrence, wrote a poem that said, "Walls resonate with thunder, cries and cheers fade fast, in silent gray, torn and exposed." So he wrote a poem about these, and they asked a number of poets to do this. Cool idea. Scalable, cheap, right? Fun. Especially when you think about this, these were poets who were participating in the festival, but this says school program all over it. But not just school program, adult program all over it. Okay. Let me show you another example. This is the haiku station, something that results from the haiku station at the Philadelphia Museum of Art associated with the Van Gogh exhibit. And these are a few haiku attached to Van Gogh's pair of boots. They asked people to write about that. Do you guys remember what a haiku is? Yes. 5 syllables, 7 syllables, 5 syllables. They're great. They're a really great tool. My family were very used to do haiku on car trips, you know. But anyway, they're easy enough that anybody can do them. So these are haiku responses to Van Gogh's pair of boots. And the one that I like the best says, "Am I to sit here deserted and lonely? Where is my owner? I sit alone now. My appearance is no more. Oh, what a cruel fate." At any rate, so on and on. These are just haiku that were left by visitors. And they say really interesting things about the painting, but I don't know why we can't do this with three-dimensional objects or objects in the collection. There are some natural history museums that are also doing this. Let's see, some natural history museums are also doing this, where they're having students write poems about haiku about moon rocks, other kinds of objects, dinosaur fossils. These are programs that allow people to use their imaginations. They don't require lots of background knowledge about your collections. So they allow people to use their imaginations to sort of connect to your collections. Okay, let me show you. This is a web page for a really interesting little museum in Chatsworth, Pennsylvania. Have any of you guys been to the Sanderson Museum? Yeah, do you like the Sanderson Museum? The Sanderson Museum, Christian Sanderson was the town historian, sort of antiquarian town historian of Chatsworth, Pennsylvania, friends with the Wyatts for a number of generations, was the fiddler and dance caller for country dancing in Chatsworth and so on. He was also a hoarder. And I'm serious about that. And when he died, his friends came in, the Wyatts and a lot of other people came in, and they knew that there were lots of interesting, important objects in the collection that had to do with the community. It also had to do with his life. They also had to take out newspapers up to here. You know, he really was a hoarder. And so this is a museum that is dedicated to this guy who was a hoarder, but who also was a community historian. And he attached notes to all the objects in the collection. So he said, this is a shoelace I broke when I attended the Herbert Hoover's inaugural, stuff like that. It gets pretty, but at any rate, there's a lot of interesting objects in here. So one of the things that they've done is they have a series that they call the History Made Personal series. These link to PDFs that you download, and they've asked volunteers, just people who are associated with the museum, to write about objects that they like in their collection. And the responses to them are not just research, right? They, or about Christian, etc. There are also other kinds of responses to the collection. So these are actually essays that are written by volunteers, and then are posted on the website in the form of PDFs. You can download them and read them. Very simple thing to do, but also is allowing a lot of people who are attached to the museum to essentially become curatorial voices. So opening up this idea of the curatorial voice. Another thing I want to talk about is object autobiography, including fictional autobiography, as a technique for getting people engaged with historical collections. And the one thing I want, how many of you guys read Hitty, Her First 100 Years when you were a girl? Yeah, it's just a great book, and I just want to recall this because it'll inspire you to think about these autobiographies. Hitty was, this doll is Hitty. I'm sorry I could not get a higher res picture of her. She now lives in the Springfield, Massachusetts Public Library in the children's room. She lives in the case there. And Rachel Field bought her in 1927 and decided that she would write a biography of this doll. She actually had no information about her. She knows she's a certain number of inches high, she's carved out of ash wood, she has a homemade dress, and that's about all we know. So what Rachel Field did was write a book about Hitty's first 100 years. It's in a first-person voice. Hitty is, when it opens, Hitty's sitting in an antique shop, and her companion is the cat who lives in the antique shop. So this is published in 1946, and it's still in print, I believe. Won a Caldecott Medal, and Dorothy Lathrop, who was a wonderful illustrator, did the pictures. So I really recommend this highly. But this is another technique that you can consider associated with collections. One of the issues that we often have is we have lots and lots of collections that have no provenance, right? They've come in the door, they had a provenance, they had a history of ownership, but it has disappeared. There was never paperwork, they were left on doorsteps. They're those found in collection objects that make your skin crawl and your hair stand on end. I mean, you sort of walk past the door where they're stored and go like that. But one of the things that you can think about is encouraging people to engage them in imaginative constructions, creating autobiographies of objects, or biographies of objects. This, by the way, is something that scholarship has gotten very interested in, material culture scholarship has gotten very interested in. And a woman who's done a lot of work with it is actually a historian of technology named Sherry Turkle. I don't know if any of you guys have read any of her stuff, where she has done these collections where she's asked people to write about objects, the most important objects in their lives, and has published a number of books, collected books where people are actually writing about objects that they own now. And it could be a laptop, it can be any number of them. I've read one on a laptop, I've read them about shoes, there's all kinds of things. But she's getting people to sort of write about collections. And so people are actively thinking about this. And it's even beginning to, the notion of the object biography or autobiography in some cases, is even showing up in things like the New York Times now is doing a almost weekly thing where there's an object and they ask where it came from. I don't know if you've seen that in like the Sunday magazine. I think it is. Leave an object and you'll say, where did the Chinese takeout box come from? And they'll try to reconstruct a biography. But that's based on some research. But there's no reason that you can't ask people to engage in sort of imaginative reconstructions of autobiographies of objects. And I recommend you read Hitty. It'll inspire you to think about that. So what happens is this is something from the Grier collection. I hate to admit how much junk like this I own, but this is a breeding bird cage from the early 20th century. Well, these are the kinds of objects that are great creative writing projects. Okay. where you can ask people to sort of write about them and comment on them, maybe even blog on them and so on. But it doesn't have to be based on the web. It can be done with paper and pencil inside your organization, inside your gallery space. It means you've got to give people a place to sit down and write. So it means that you have to provide an amenity in your collection space that you often haven't thought about doing in the past. But you need to give people a space for writing. But I think there's a real payoff for doing things like that. So what I want to talk a little bit about is the notion of community-based collecting. Okay, moving beyond the domestic again and opening up the role of curator. That's really hard for us. We studied so hard to get to be curators. We worked so hard to get to do this, and we've worked so hard to become the experts on our collections. And what I'm saying is not to denigrate what you're doing at all, or to say that having an authoritative voice is something that we should abandon completely. But I do think that what's happened is people's expectations are different now. We often say that any idiot can get on the web, right? Right. Well, their expectations now is that people's expectations increasingly are that they actually get to say something to you, and that hopefully you're going to say something back, right? That there's going to be some kind of conversation. That content is not going to just come from you, that they're going to also make some contribution to it. And libraries are way ahead of museums on this, which is not surprising. They're way ahead on a lot of this stuff. One of the most interesting experiments that I've seen is what's called crowdsourcing, associated with archival collections, the stuff that you've never had time to transcribe. What happens is you scan your diary or your documents, you put it up on the web as a PDF, and then you let people go to work transcribing it for you. It is amazing what is coming out of those projects. And what happens is they correct each other. Someone will start the transcription, someone else will pick it up, and they will actually correct each other in the process. They disagree about reading the handwriting, and they'll actually correct each other. And you can sort of track that now. It's just it's amazing. And one of the things that it's doing is that it's increasing involvement in archives. Right? Archives have been a place that museums, historical societies have had these archives, and except for genealogists, they've been sort of dead ducks. Okay. Well, if you let people in to actually sort of interact with the documents, and by putting them up as a PDF, what that means is that it's, nothing's at risk. There's no problems with doing this. It's easy to scan them and put up a page as a PDF. Then what you discover is people really go to town on this stuff. And their level of engagement with your organization goes up because they are actually contributing to it. Not just money, not just feet on the ground, but they're actually contributing in terms of generating content, right, that's useful for other people later. So we're letting them in behind the scenes. Right? It's all about letting them in behind the scenes. Another good, probably one of the most extreme examples of this on a large scale is the 9/11 collecting that the New York Historical Society did. And I will tell you that I have heard that the curators, and when the director of the Historical Society said, get down there and start collecting, right, at ground zero, that the curatorial staff fought him on that. They didn't want to go because they were worried that they would bring back something that wasn't going to be important. Well, we can't know what is. Then they got religion as they got down there. But one of the things is, if you collect more current things in your community, you may make some mistakes sometimes. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. Because if you don't bring it in, it's not going to survive. Right? Sometimes you have to take a chance and say, this is something that I think is going to be okay. 50 years down the road, maybe another curator is not going to agree with me, but I think what happens is you want them to take a chance. So this is collecting 9/11, and they collected everything from, this is a card from a school in Lower Manhattan, and then that is a police car door. They brought back some objects like that, which is pretty brave stuff. So, I mean, I'm telling you, it's time to start collecting your community disasters, but that's, but at any rate, it's a good example of going out there, taking a chance, and doing kind of community-based collecting. People brought things in, the curators brought things in, they really opened up the process of adding to the collection, and I think it really paid off in terms of, that was an organization that did not have a lot of goodwill in the city. People didn't care about the New York Historical Society, but after this, they became a real player in the city and a place that people began to really care about. So doing that kind of community-based collecting and going and being aggressive and going out in the community really pays off in terms of the goodwill that you can generate in your community. So I really want to push you to think about going beyond the domestic. Right? It's so easy to bring in another set of dishes or another wedding dress. I know none of you want another wedding dress, but you know, it's easy to bring in that stuff. But what you really need to do is think about the public life of your community, and especially if you're a small historical organization in a small town, your community is under pressure, and it needs you to bring in things that sort of represent its best qualities, okay, and things that it did in the past. These are objects from the Corbett Calloway. The Corbett Calloway Memorial Library in Odessa, Delaware. The stuff on the right has to do with associational life lodges and so on. On the left is a group from the Delaware Campers Association. This was their license plate, if you were a member of the Campers Association. Let me really push you to think about small businesses. Okay? This is a pet store, but and again from the Grier collection, this is what I can grab fast. But photographs and artifacts, and if you have an archive, papers. God, bring in the papers. Oh man, they're as scarce as hen's teeth at this point for these small community-based businesses. But these are the kinds of objects that and kinds of collections that really are not represented with our overemphasis on domestic life. One of the easiest ways to get into collecting community life is to collect occupational dress. You've got a lot of party dresses in your collection, and wedding dresses, and nice children's clothing, and probably some mourning dresses and stuff like that. But what you don't have is you don't have a waitress's outfit. Okay. One of the things that the Laurel Historical Society at one point had a volunteer curator who was really concerned about that. And he brought in stuff like this. He brought in when the police got new uniforms, he collected the old ones. He collected firefighters' uniforms. He collected waitress uniforms. He collected Red Cross outfits from World War II from community mobilization. Okay. We found some tremendous stuff when we really got into that collection. We did it 20 years ago.